If you've been following the game industry over the past few years, then you probably remember this moment from E3 2019. It was during Bethesda's presentation, when famed game designer Shinji Mikami walked on stage to introduce the next game from his studio, Tango Gameworks. Mikami was joined by Ikumi Nakamura, a game artist turned creative director whose energetic voice and bubbly personality quickly charmed the audience. Fans found her so endearing that her presence arguably overshadowed the game she was there to present. That game was Ghostwire Tokyo, and its reveal was accompanied by a short trailer, which showed a number of Japanese horror-inspired vignettes that myself and many others found thoroughly captivating. Little did we know that Ghostwire Tokyo would be one of the last games ever developed by Tango, as in 2024, the studio would be unceremoniously shuttered by Bethesda's new owner, Microsoft. Considering what would befall Tango after its release, I think it's worth taking a second look at Ghostwire Tokyo. What is it? What did it do well? What did it do wrong? And was this game responsible for Tango's closure? Let's start with that first question. What is Ghostwire Tokyo? Unlike Tango's previous games, The Evil Within and The Evil Within 2, Ghostwire Tokyo is not a survival horror game. It's actually an open-world, first-person shooter. Naturally, there's a far greater focus on exploration and action in Ghostwire compared to Evil Within, but what really sets Ghostwire apart is how Japanese it is. The Evil Within games largely appeal to Western sensibilities by taking place in an American city with an American cast. Additionally, many of the enemies in these games are zombies, a type of monster which, while originating in Haitian folklore, has been thoroughly assimilated into Western culture. Ghostwire, conversely, is set in the Shibuya ward of Tokyo. The game's cast of characters is entirely Japanese, and in the settings menu, Japanese is actually the game's default language for voiceover. This game is so Japanese that kanji literally rain down from the dark night sky blanketing Tokyo. Suffice to say, Ghostwire does not attempt to pander to a Western audience. Instead, I imagine that the folks at Tango hope to create a love letter to Japanese horror, while simultaneously introducing a number of Japanese folktales and traditions to a foreign audience. I actually think the game's setting is one of its greatest strengths. As a foreigner, I feel that Tango did a very good job of making Japanese folklore both accessible and immediately compelling. It's clear that the game's designers put a lot of effort into making this virtual Shibuya resemble its real-world counterpart, for example by recreating landmarks such as Shibuya Crossing and Drunkard's Alley. As a result, there's a strong sense of place in Ghostwire Tokyo. This sense of place is furthered by Tango's ability to make every corner of the game world feel important. I find that open-world games often resemble a diorama, wherein most of the environment is no more than a facade, a static mesh which the player is unable to interact with. But in Ghostwire, nearly every sliver of the map hides something. There could be a collectible, or some jars of cash, or perhaps just a door which you can open and close to your heart's content. Though the game mostly lacks NPCs, these interactive touches allow Shibuya to feel alive and full of secrets worth finding. I do, however, have one big problem with Ghostwire Tokyo's open world. It's a pain to navigate. There are a few reasons for this. Firstly, the majority of the game world is composed of extremely tall buildings which often obscure the path ahead. This makes it easier to get lost in side streets and alleys when looking for your destination, which can be frustrating. It's worth noting that this issue is somewhat alleviated by the presence of tengus, bird-like creatures which the player can use as grapple points to reach high ground. But these creatures are only present in specific areas of the game. Secondly, this is a first-person game with no FOV slider. This means that the player's range of view is pretty limited and can't be modified in any way without using mods. The player's vision is then further constrained by this heavy rain particle that I discussed earlier, that kind of kanji coming from the sky, and a general lack of light since the game takes place almost entirely at night. These problems are compounded by the fact that because Ghostwire's open world is a replica of a real city, it often lacks visual signposting. Worlds like Zelda's Hyrule and Cyberpunk's Night City are entirely fictional. As such, the designers of those spaces were empowered to move structures around in order to highlight and subtly guide the players to important locations. Ghostwire's designers didn't have the same luxury. They still had to remain somewhat faithful to the layout of Shibuya, however unintuitive it might be. Additionally, because it's based on a real place, Ghostwire Shibuya is sorely lacking in visual variety. Most districts look about the same, so I had to constantly rely on the map screen in order to understand where I was in relation to whatever place I was trying to reach. I couldn't just use my intuition to navigate through the game world. Whenever I did try to ignore the map, I would end up wandering around, frustrated and lost. But perhaps getting lost isn't such a bad thing. See, by losing my way, I was able to discover what I believe is the true heart of Ghostwire Tokyo. Despite its advertising, this isn't a game about yokai or monsters or weird hand symbols. No, this is a game about space. Mundane space. See, in our society, we have customs which dictate how we navigate any given environment. Stay on the trail, don't go down that alley, or use the sidewalk are some explicit examples of these customs in action. But those customs also function more subtly. For example, as a young teenager, I would jaywalk constantly, but only when there weren't many people around. Whenever I observed others waiting at the crosswalk, I felt subliminally moved to join them instead. We, as humans, like to be part of groups. Nobody wants to feel like the odd person out, straying from the desired path. That need is exactly what makes the real-world Shibuya crossing so chaotic. There are no dominant flows of pedestrian movement. There is no herd to follow. But in Ghostwire Tokyo, there are no pedestrians at all. There are no people at all. Those social norms, the ones which told teenage me not to jaywalk around other people, were no longer being enforced or in play at all. The player has no guiding crowds to follow. They must carve their own path through Shibuya, a path which may very well stray from the main roads and off into dark alleys and gated construction sites, places where there usually aren't many people, where we don't imagine we would normally be walking. In games, NPCs are a crucial part of visual signposting. Because I could no longer rely on NPCs to tell me where I should go, I found myself spending lots of times in vacant bathrooms and empty apartment buildings. To be honest, I found those abandoned, purposeless side spaces to be no less compelling than the megamalls and skyscrapers the developers clearly put far more time into crafting. I guess it's a blessing that I enjoyed the mere act of walking around Ghostwire Tokyo's world, since most of the non-story content is pretty one-note and tedious. The game's main collectible are spirits, of which there are over 200,000. You collect them a few hundred at a time, but finding them all takes a lot of effort which the game is only willing to repay with meager amounts of money and experience points. There are also a host of side quests, many of which I found to be a bit charming. One particularly funny side quest involves finding rolls of toilet paper for the spirit who refuses to pass on until he, does his unfinished business. But these side quests lack any sort of depth. They are fetch quests, and as such, I largely ignored them once the story picked up steam. Ghostwire Tokyo was directed by Akumi Nakamura, until her departure from Tango Gameworks in September 2019, at which point her role was given to Kenji Kimura. Kimura is best known for his work on fighting games, including Soul Calibur 4 and Tekken 5. At first, I was curious as to why a man with this resume would be working on a first-person shooter, but calling Ghostwire Tokyo a shooter might be a misnomer. Aiming isn't that important because many attacks have a wide area of effect. The real focus of Ghostwire's combat system is positioning. There's no hit scan. Instead, enemies either use melee attacks or shoot large glowing projectiles which can, with proper timing, be dodged, blocked, or parried. In this way, Ghostwire shares a lot of DNA with the fighting games Kimura helped to design. As you've probably noticed, there are no guns in this game either. Instead, you shoot projectiles from your hands using 3 elemental styles: wind, water, and fire. Wind functions like a standard pistol or machine gun, and it's the weapon mode I found myself using most often during my playthrough. The other two elemental styles are extremely simple. Fire is basically a rocket launcher, and water is basically a shotgun. Once an enemy has been sufficiently damaged, its core is revealed and can be broken for an insta-kill and some health points, along with an extremely satisfying animation. None of the gunplay in Ghostwire is bad, per se, but it is all unremarkable. Under different circumstances, this might not have been an issue, but you have to remember that this game was published by Bethesda, a company which, by 2022, had built a name for itself as the premier publisher of single-player FPS games. Yes, Fallout's gunplay can be good or bad, depending on the day, but Doom and Wolfenstein, Bethesda's other premier franchises, are known for their excellent game feel and impactful-sounding guns. It might be unfair that Ghostwire was competing against those games, but that's the reality of the situation. As a Bethesda title, there are certain expectations about what your game should look like and how it should feel. Expectations that Ghostwire failed to meet, regardless of whether or not the developers were ever intent on meeting them. Ghostwire also contains quite a few stealth sections, wherein your powers are taken away from you. In these situations, you're forced to rely on sneak takedowns, alongside a bow and various talismans which allow you to manipulate the game world in small ways. If I'm being honest, I don't think these stealth levels are very good. In fact, I'd say they kind of blow. There's no quick save system in Ghostwire. You either have to manually save every minute, which is annoying, or risk dying and getting sent back to an autosave, having to redo all the work you just did. Beyond that, most stealth sections are trivialized by the fact that this is an open-world game. It's pretty easy to just run away from enemies when they detect you and wait until they go back to their scripted routines. At least these sections are pretty easy because the game gives you an X-ray vision power, which you can exploit to see where enemies are and position yourself accordingly. At this point, you're probably wondering why I haven't touched on Ghostwire Tokyo's story. The truth is, while Ghostwire has atmosphere in spades, there isn't much of a core narrative to speak on. The game revolves around Akito, a young man who is killed in a motorcycle accident while driving to visit his wounded sister Mari at the hospital. Moments after Akito's death, the whole of Shibuya is consumed by a thick fog which turns all humans into spirits. The fog also unleashes all manner of nasty creatures, called visitors, acting sort of like the Mist in The Mist, based on the book The Mist. Akito is then revived by Keike, a mysterious figure who grants him elemental powers in exchange for Akito's cooperation in defeating the mysterious masked man who has both unleashed the fog and kidnapped Mari. Unfortunately, it seems the team at Tango went to the Destiny 2 school of boring screenwriting. Everything following the opening chapter is, in essence, a prolonged fetch quest. We need to go here, but we can't do that yet, so let's go here, but that then requires us to go here, and so on and so forth. One of the most egregious examples of this occurs in the game's third chapter, which revolves around reaching a beam of light at the base of a forest. You go to a building, but the door's locked, so you have to find another way in. Once you find another way in and clear the building, you head towards the Pillar of Light, only to get ambushed and tasked with destroying some totems. Okay, now that's done, so we can continue, right? Wrong. We actually have to go use a payphone. But it has to be the right color payphone in a little neighborhood full of payphones. And you also have to find a prepaid phone card as well. Okay, now are you ready to go to the Beam of Light? Sorry, but you're gonna have to go to a parking lot to find a locker key, which takes you to a locker where you find an apartment key, which takes you to an apartment, and oh god, just end my suffering, please. By the time I actually reached the Beam of Light some hour or two later, I was thoroughly miffed and mentally exhausted. All the anticipatory excitement that I felt when I first saw the Beam of Light in the distance had faded by the time I actually reached it. And this wasn't a one-time experience. At its worst, this game is nothing more than a long series of wild goose chases. You'll run to point A, then to point B, then C, accomplishing nothing at all as the game slowly feeds you just enough skill points to create the illusion of progress. But it's just that. An illusion. The combat doesn't meaningfully change after the first couple of hours, and neither does the exploration. Eventually, around 7 hours into my playthrough, Ghostwire Tokyo stopped feeling like a game and started feeling like a chore. I became fully conscious of the fact that I was just checking boxes and cleaning icons off a map. I could feel myself slipping out of the fiction of the game and back into my own room, a room where I sat alone, in silence, clicking and tapping keys over and over again. I wasn't having fun anymore. I had left the trance of the machine zone. The illusion was shattered. I will say, despite the lackluster pacing and boring writing, Ghostwire's cutscenes are excellent. The cutscene direction here is top-notch. The camera is super dynamic, tracking fast-moving characters from a number of angles. Nearly every shot is well-composed and readable, and I really appreciate the animators were willing to use pre-rendered cutscenes, which is a real rarity in today's gaming landscape. By 2022, at the time of Ghostwire's release, Unreal Engine 4 was getting quite old. I think the animators knew that art direction alone couldn't totally prevent the game from looking dated. But pre-rendered cutscenes, now that could give this game a graphical leg up against the competition. And yeah, it does. These cutscenes look incredible. The animation work is so fluid, especially in the human characters. They move so believably, without any hint of stiffness whatsoever. I recommend looking up some of these cutscenes for yourself and watching them, if only for the visual spectacle. Before we continue, I wanted to briefly discuss the Corrupted Case File, a free prequel visual novel which was released before the launch of Ghostwire proper. As such, one might assume that you're supposed to play the Corrupted Case File before playing Ghostwire Tokyo, but I don't think that's the best way of doing things. In my opinion, the optimal time to play the Corrupted Case File is once you're already a few hours into Ghostwire proper. This is because the Corrupted Case File does a very poor job of introducing the main game's world to new players, but still contains a number of Ghostwire lore tidbits that existing fans may find compelling. This visual novel revolves around Ryota, a young boy who contacts supernatural detective KK in hopes that he can help Ryota find his missing friend. Ryota doesn't appear in the main game, so I find it odd that he gets so much screen time in this visual novel. Additionally, KK, Rinko, Ed, and Erika, who all do appear in the main game, are present here. But KK is the only member of that quartet who actually gets a proper introduction. The other three are just there. In the main game, Rinko, Ed, and Erika each serve unique and distinct narrative purposes. In this 20-minute visual novel, all they do is stand around and yell at KK. Their dialogue is fun, sure, but it's the kind of banter that's only interesting to freaks like me, who actually care about the world of Ghostwire. This visual novel isn't just focused on narrative, though. It actually tries to teach the player about the main game's mechanics, which I found pretty interesting, even if it kind of fails on that front as well. Towards the end of the Corrupted Case File lies a turn-based combat encounter, in which KK can use various powers from the main game. There's also a moment where you complete a little tracing puzzle to clear some purple sludge. Both the tracing puzzle and the purple sludge are present in the main game, but the two mechanics never interact outside of this visual novel. They serve totally distinct and separate purposes in Ghostwire proper, which makes their interaction here memorable. Perhaps it's a remnant of a period earlier in the design phase when it was supposed that the tracing puzzle would be used to clear the sludge, instead of for an entirely different purpose. Alright, now that little intermission is done, we can head back to the main story. I know I've been taking a lot of digs at Ghostwire for its pretty bare-bones narrative. And yet, somehow, despite this game's mess of a story, and it is a mess, Ghostwire Tokyo manages to deliver one of the most evocative and moving moments of any game I've played over the past few years. I'm going to give a light spoiler warning here, because I will be discussing an endgame sequence, but I don't think my words alone can do this section justice. It really is worth experiencing firsthand, be that by actually playing Ghostwire Tokyo yourself or looking up a walkthrough online. This sequence takes place in the game's final chapter, during a mission titled Mari, the name of the protagonist Akito's missing sister. By this point, we know that Akito and Mari are orphans, and that Mari has been hospitalized after being wounded in a fire at the siblings' childhood home. But so far, We've only seen these events through Akito's eyes. In this sequence, Akito is forced to relive his traumatic past through the eyes of his sister. There's no combat in this sequence, nor are there any puzzles. There are no collectibles either, save for some healing items. It's a 10-minute long walking sim sequence, one which is very reminiscent of games like Dear Esther and What Remains of Edith Finch, but still uniquely evocative. The player, as Akito, paces slowly through a series of vignettes. These span from Mari's birth to their parents' death, to the siblings falling out as they struggle to get by on their own. Each scene is wonderfully composed. The lighting shifts several times, bouncing between lovingly warm to spine-chillingly cold, depending on the vignette. All humans are represented by glowing spirits, which float idly like the figures in the Chinese room's Everybody's Gone to the Rapture. The whole sequence is set against a backdrop of subtle, melancholic music, which begins to swell as the sibling situation becomes increasingly dire. This level reaches its climax with a long set of stairs, which stretch downwards and downwards. Walking down the stairs, it eventually becomes too dark to see anything in the distance, but you must keep walking and pray that something awaits you at the bottom of this abyss. Soon afterwards, the sequence reaches its end, but this little stair moment during this Mari mission really stuck with me. It's this deliberate downward movement. You're not in free fall, you're in control, and yet you can't help but go down, step by step by step. At a certain point, going back up doesn't feel like an option anymore. All you can do is keep walking as your vision gets darker and darker. This scene beautifully captures what it feels like to be in the midst of grief. The sense of loneliness and isolation, the fear that your world is over, that there's nothing left for you but void. Endless trudging down, down, down. Most people are able to reach the bottom, to see the light at the end of the tunnel and begin the climb up. But even those who make it through are haunted by the memory of those hours after the death of a loved one, that feeling of downwards motion, that sudden encroach in darkness, that journey down the stairs. If Ghostwire Tokyo was a linear game, if all the open-world padding was removed, I could see it becoming an all-timer. Unfortunately for me, that's not what happened. I don't think anyone is to blame for what I view as this game's shortcomings, but it's hard to see so vividly what Ghostwire could have been had it stuck to the formula established in the game's opening hours. The open-world gameplay isn't bad, per se. I think Ghostwire's combat system actually works best when fights take place in the streets of Shibuya, on wide roads with lots of cover. Movement is also pretty fun, especially when you're grappling between Tengus and gliding across rooftops. But I'd trade the open world for more carefully crafted linear sequences, like the ones present at the beginning and end of Ghostwire, in a heartbeat. The visual storytelling in those smaller levels is some of the best in all of gaming, period. It really is incredible. I cannot overstate that enough, and it's something I really wish we got more of. Which brings me to our final subject. Upon release in 2022, Ghostwire Tokyo was met with a mixed reception. According to OpenCritic, a game review aggregate site, Ghostwire had an average critic score of 77 out of 100. Camp Shi, who reviewed Ghostwire for IGN, gave it a 7 out of 10. He praised the game for its art direction, but criticized it for what he called, quote, one-dimensional combat and uninteresting mission design, end quote. Similar criticisms were levied against Ghostwire in reviews from Eurogamer and PC Gamer. While no concrete sales data has been released, from these reviews and from looking at social media and following the game in general, I get the sense that Ghostwire Tokyo didn't exactly light the world on fire. You have to remember that this was a timed PS5 exclusive in early 2022, at a time when Sony's new system was still being plagued by stock and supply chain issues. In 2023, the game apparently reached 4 million players, but that metric was announced after its release on Xbox Game Pass, so I don't think it can really be trusted. Even though Ghostwire Tokyo was likely a financial failure, it would not be the last game developed by Tango Gameworks. On January 25th, 2023, the studio announced and then released Hi-Fi Rush. I remember being quite shocked when I first saw this game, not just because it was shadow dropped, but because it was so different from Tango's previous output. This was a family-friendly, Saturday morning cartoon-inspired, rhythm-stylish action game. And I loved it. Clearly, I wasn't the only one, too. Despite a lack of advertising, Hi-Fi Rush quickly became a hit, one which breathed new life into the frankly dying Xbox brand. The game was critically acclaimed, receiving scores of 8 and 9 across the board, and it seems that the game was a financial success as well, in spite of Game Pass's confusing monetization model. Suddenly, in the span of only a day, the future of Tango seemed brighter than ever. And yet, I imagine that most of you watching this video know how this story ends. On May 7th, 2024, it was announced that Tango Gameworks would be ceasing its operations permanently. The news came from a leaked internal email written by head of Xbox Game Studios, Matt Booty, who wrote, quote, "We are making these tough decisions in order to create capacity to increase investment in other parts of our portfolio and focus on our priority games," end quote. Notice how I said decisions, plural. Tango wasn't the only studio to be hit by this round of company restructuring. 2 other studios were also dissolved. Arcane Austin, the studio behind Prey and Redfall, and Alpha Dog Games, who created the mobile game Mighty Doom. Roundhouse Studios was also stripped of its independence and forced to join the Elder Scrolls Online machine. A significant number of Bethesda corporate employees were laid off as well. I wish I could end this video on a high note, I really do, but there's no good way to spin any of this. Tango wasn't the first studio to be crushed by Microsoft, and they certainly won't be the last. Xbox keeps gobbling up studios, but the brand hasn't shown itself to be profitable in any substantive way. In a 2024 Q2 financial report, Microsoft claimed that Xbox revenue had increased by 61% in only 3 months. But a whopping 55 of those 61 percentage points were the result of the recently approved Activision Blizzard acquisition. When separated from Activision, Xbox is barely making any money. Thus, I simply can't see how Microsoft's gaming brand can continue to exist without even more layoffs and studio closures. I say this next line with 100% sincerity. It's an honest question. If a promising studio like Tango, one that's making critically and financially successful games, and one that's making financially sustainable games, can't stay open, then who can? Truly, who can? I don't know. I don't know if Xbox knows either. A few weeks before Tango's closure, I had the privilege of attending the annual Game Developers Conference in San Francisco, California. I had a wonderful time. I got to walk through an awe-inspiring expo hall, see a number of amazing panels, and meet so many talented creators. But the whole event was somewhat overshadowed by a thick air of despondency. There was a palpable sense of anxiety, this fear that every single person at the convention could be fired with the snap of a finger, that all the students in attendance would never find a stable job, that all the junior developers would never climb the corporate ladder, and that all the senior developers wouldn't have a pension if they even had the chance to properly retire in the first place. Sitting at the front of the Moscone Convention Center, amidst all that doom and gloom, was a modest rectangular booth labeled Xbox. On the final day of the convention, in all my naivete, I decided to walk up to that Xbox booth. Perhaps I was looking to find some semblance of reassurance that Xbox was actually doing fine, and that the industry was going to be alright, for this was just a bump in the road. Obviously, I didn't get that. I mean, we all saw what happened a few weeks later. But I did get a pair of black socks. These socks are adorned ankle to toe with a single message, repeated over and over again. A message that reads, Xbox loves game devs. Thank you for watching. Apologies for the slight delay in getting this video out. I've been very, very busy with work and life stuff, but I still really enjoy making these videos for you, and I am just stunned and humbled by the enormous reception to the Control video. It was beyond anything I could have imagined, and I mean, just fills me with joy and gratitude. I really thank you all for your time, your engagement, your comments. I really, really could not be more grateful. I know I'm repeating myself a little here, but I really am thankful. So, really, from the bottom of my heart, thank you. I'm still figuring out exactly what the next video is going to be about, and I'm also thinking about what my format's going to look like, trying to find my niche, but I trust that I'll get there in time, and I hope that you'll continue to stick with me on this journey. If you like this video, I got it's obligatory, I guess I kind of have to say it, please consider subscribing or sharing it with a friend. It really does help the channel grow, but what I do care more about the channel growing and about numbers and about metrics and anything is making good, interesting, thoughtful content that I feel is worth your time. And I'm going to keep doing that. And I'm going to keep really trying to work to upgrade, to, get better and improve with every single video. So, yeah, just catch you, and as I guess is now my saying, catch you in the next one.